You know, everybody loves pollsters during election year, but Mark is one of those pollsters that everybody loves the whole year round. So thank you, Mark. I had occasion to be talking to Congressman David Dreyer a little while ago, and we ended up talking about James Madison. And so I thought of him coming to California, drawing up all 5'4" of him and looking around at what we've got in terms of a governance system and saying, this beeth not what I was talking about. Because you look at the mess we have made for ourselves in a way by embracing this abundance of democracy, which Monroe thought was the solution to the problems of democracy. I think if he were to see a ballot, classic California ballot initiative ballot, he might think a little bit differently about the whole thing. So I want to introduce the people who are up here to help us wend our way through some of these issues in the first of our two panels. We have Steve Glazer, who is the president of Glazer and Associates, also the mayor of Orinda, who has served as Jerry Brown's political advisor since 2009. Thanks for being here. And we have Eric McGhee, policy fellow at PPIC, who probably gets to put his name on a lot of the stuff you get to read coming out of here, right? Okay, good. Rob Stutzman, whom you may know as a Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Schwarzenegger, worked on his campaign and is the founder and president of Stutzman Public Affairs. And Mac Taylor, the legislative analyst at the Legislative Analyst Office, the man who brings you the numbers that each side finds reason to like and not to like. So thank you all for being here. We heard a lot of what Mark was alluding to, and so many of these seem to go to the idea of how we've changed the basic three powers structure from the federal level into the state of California that has made the voters essentially a different kind of fourth branch of government who end up feeling their oats and sometimes doing it not as well as they should and giving us institutions that, you know, it's easier to amend the 10 Commandments, I think, than it is to amend this California Constitution, which is second only in length to the Constitution of India, with like 500 amendments. I'm always afraid every time I go to the polls that I'm going to change the California Constitution. I really don't feel like a founding father, maybe a founding mother, but I need a little more information. And California, I think Californians, apropos of what Mark was saying, if you look further into that study, California voters say, yeah, I know about this, I can vote on that, but if you look a little further, they really don't understand the consequences of some of the mechanisms. It's like they've gone into a store with somebody else's credit card and say, yeah, I'll have some of that and I'll have some of that, and then they realize it's their own bill that they're charging up. And they also don't understand, for example, the nature of the income tax structure and how dependent we are on it, and some of the other issues that they vote for without counting quite the cost. They used to, in the 1960s, they had menus for ladies in restaurants that didn't have prices because it was unladylike to have prices and to be thinking about money. And of course, that's why they said your date was over there sweating, oh my God, she's going for the caviar instead of the salad. We have the unpriced menu in California when we go in with ballot initiatives. There's something in the voter pamphlet that says this is how much it's going to cost, but the voters really don't think about it. So a couple of questions that we will look to right now, looking forward to how to make things better, whether or not some of the institutions we put in, like the top two voting or redistricting, are really remedying some of the problems. So since nobody's running for office, we're not going to do opening statements, but well, let's start as we began then with Steve Glazer to give us his sense of what the reforms we have tried to do to reform the reforms have been doing so far.
Well, first, I think it's really easy to pile on when you know, the popularity of our institutions is so low. And I just think we have to recognize that these are tough times that we're living in. And we can love our democracy but be unhappy with how it's working, partly because our economic situation is what it is. And there's a lot of people struggling. And we are a majority vote system for a lot of things, not everything. And that means you could have 49% on the losing side of a lot of things and be unhappy. And one of the things that all of us learn in life is that we tend to remember the things that are negative more than the things that are positive. I didn't get my way here, I'm going to remember that, versus all the times that you got your way. And so there is a cynicism and there's a frustration level, and I think certainly we want to work to make that better, but a lot of that is built in. So I'm happy with a lot of the reforms that are coming about now, and a lot of people have worked really hard on those. By the way, I'm speaking for myself, not for the governor on these things. I want to be clear about that. But I think the open primary is very a very exciting change in how California is going to be governed going forward. That with the reapportionment creating these Republican districts and Democratic districts, we had a lot of representatives up here that had no interest in seeing the other side, trying to find the middle. And I think that with the independent reapportionment and the open primary, I'm very encouraged that over time, we're going to get different representatives up here, and they're going to bring a greater problem-solving mentality, which I think the public will understand and see, and hopefully will create greater confidence in how our government is functioning.
Rob, you worked with the former governor. Do you agree that amending some of these institutions with different procedures, like the top two voting and some of the redistricting processes that are underway, is going to be a remedy?
Time will tell if it's a remedy. It certainly gives opportunity for change, particularly, I believe, the redistricting reform. You can never take politics out of redistricting. There were howls of politics still meddling with the commission's work, but by and large, you have more or less 15 to 20% of all three delegations, Assembly, Senate, and Congressional, now being competitive. Pure toss-ups could go with the whims of an election cycle. Competition is a good thing. We passed term limits, which I've revised my opinion on over the years and think was a dreadful mistake. But we passed term limits in this state to get rid of Willie Brown as Speaker. What really got rid of Willie Brown as Speaker was competition. It's a faint memory, but the Republicans did take the Assembly in the mid 90s, and that is how he lost his speakership. So I'm very encouraged by what we've done with redistricting. The top two open primaries, it's interesting. I don't know what it means yet. I think it's healthy to have the open primary in June, but as Mark indicated, we still have these low, very partisan turnout elections in June. So your primary makeup is still very partisan. There's opportunity for gaming, which isn't a good thing. I mean, a lot of this depends on the size of the field. But I'm fascinated with this prospect of intra-party runoffs, which we have 28 or 29 of in California, because it gives franchise to the Republican in Santa Monica or the Democrat in Huntington Beach, depending on the race. And I just think instinctively that's a positive thing. It also extends competition beyond just competitive districts, so that Democrat incumbents like Levine and Butler and Republican incumbent like Gaines have to face stiff competition in November, which means they're talking to voters, which should inherently be positive.
You don't think we'll see more of the Sherman-Berman kind of race?
Well, some of that is, one time because you get this realignment also from redistricting. They ran out of districts over there on the west side of LA. But I think it certainly raises the specter of that, but I guess the question is that so bad? That all the voters now have franchise in that district, where in the past we wouldn't even be talking about that seat, as Brad Sherman would be probably running roughshod over some Republican because of a 25-point registration advantage.
And Eric, looking more deeply into the PPIC analysis of voters and people who vote, people who don't vote, there's a great sense of confidence in their own power. People talk about the legislature not wanting to give up power, but voters don't want to give up power, and they end up voting on very odd things about which they may not be very conversant. We saw the consequences of Prop 98 with all of that. So we briefly, and we heard Mark about voter education. Everyone gets that pamphlet in the mail. It looks like the old phone book landing on your doorstep. What can be done to get more information and better information to voters that will also encourage non-voters to come to the table?
So I'm not sure that there's sort of two separate questions there. One is what can we do to get more non-voters into elections, and then the other is how do we get more information to voters, better information. I mean, I think there's always more that you can do to get more information out to voters, to get them better informed. If it's a high-profile initiative, it's going to have a lot of money spent on either side, and a lot of information is going to get out to voters anyway.
Is it information or is it spin?
No, I think it is. I mean, it's so if you have a competitive contest, people often disparage campaigns, but campaigns do inform voters, and I think the research on this is pretty clear that it brings people to a more informed position than they would be otherwise. There's a lot of complaints about negative ads and so forth, but negative ads tend to provide information, real information that's valuable for making decisions. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that that more campaigning is necessarily a bad thing. I think it brings information to the voters and helps them make better decisions. And I think there's other things that can be done in terms of informing people in the process, as Mark was saying, of signing initiatives and just getting things started in the first place, to provide information about who's funding them and who's supporting them and so forth. I think that's a valuable thing to do as well. And then there's the separate, so there's always more that can be done to inform voters and help them make better decisions. And I think by and large, voters do tend to be reasonably cautious and if anything, tend to vote no on an initiative.
Like 2 out of 3 initiatives historically they voted no on?
Yeah, and it's very easy. It's much easier to get voters to vote no than to vote yes. So that's all well and good. I mean, and as it should be. Don't change the status quo unless you're sure that that's where you want to go next. That's actually one of our sort of founding principles of our democracy. Then the separate question is, how do you get more people to vote? And I think that is an important question, and that's going to be more than just information. It's going to be a process of mobilization, a process of maybe making it easier to vote, and we've taken some steps in that direction in terms of the online registration recently, in terms of the election day registration. We'll just have to see whether those have any impact, but they're sort of, it is 2 separate questions, and I think one is a matter of, yes, more information is always better, and then the other is a question of, well, we've got some demographic challenges in California that make it hard to increase voting, but there are some interventions that can be done to probably boost turnout beyond what it is now.
And Mac Taylor, the guy who wants everybody to have the menu with the prices on it, who's the tougher nut to get these numbers across to? Is it the legislators or is it the voters, the sense that there are economic repercussions to every single thing and that those may be interrelated?
Well, I think it's more a problem of issues are so complex that you can have a certain level of information, and we provide it in the voter pamphlet. The legislature knows what those numbers are. The people have a sense for what it does, but you don't always know the consequences of it. I mean, think about Proposition 98. Started out in 1988 as a fairly simple statement. We want school funding to kind of stay stable and grow with the economy. Well, we amended it, the voters amended it 2 years later, and now it's almost incomprehensible the way it works, and people don't know what it means. It's counterintuitive. And so oftentimes these things just kind of go beyond our ability to understand all of the implications of how it might operate in the future. And I think you run into that if you think about spending limits. There are a lot of people who suggest that as a way of controlling our problems, of overspending our money in good times. Well, it kind of makes intuitive sense. You should limit the spending during good times, save it, and restore it, and have it available during the down times. The question is, how do you mechanically put something in your already very long Constitution that can possibly conceive of all of the different possibilities that come up in your fiscal situation? And so I think it's kind of limiting in our ability to understand all those implications.
Governor Schwarzenegger famously said he wanted to blow up boxes, but I think whenever anybody hears that, they say, yeah, but not that box. That box is my box, so you can't blow that one up. So I'm not asking Steve Glazer to speak for the current governor, but is that idea an appealing one in California that we never seem to be able to muster the brass to do it? Or are we being rhetorically overblown in talking about blowing up these boxes?
I think it's just a form of manipulation. And it's advertising. It's not really the root of the issue. It's just trying to be appealing to a voter's instinct or emotion, and that's how a lot of things happen. So, cut up the credit card, blow up the boxes. It all sounds good, but what does it really mean? And so if you analyze what it really means and break it down and talk about specifically, then that's a meaningful conversation, and that's fine. But no one really understood what he meant by blow up the boxes. Just it's anti-government, not happy with the way things are going. And certainly when he talked about cutting up the credit card.
Or you forgot to mention take away the cell phones, by the way.
Well, that's true. Except we've consolidated state government, eliminated dozens of commissions, and you can talk about it in a more meaty way. Certainly the credit cards or the cars is one way to connect with voters, but you have to go beyond, you have to go below the surface there. And so when you say cut up the credit card, it doesn't mean that you end your term with the $35 billion in borrowing and debt that you've left to the next guy. So that's a meaningful examination of whether we really did cut up the credit card or not. So cell phone, touche, but let's look and see how state government has been constrained. And there's 30,000 less state employees now than there were 18 months ago. So is that a meaningful element of constraint? I'd say probably yes.
Well, Rob, let's talk about then with the blowing up of boxes, et cetera. Does what we have done so far, like the top two voting, the redistricting questions, do those constitute blowing up boxes, or are those just sort of knocking them over?
Well, first, real quick, though, I do need to point out that the Schwarzenegger slogan, granted a political slogan of blowing up boxes, actually led to a very substantive study that's been unparalleled, which was the performance review. Now, there's a variety of opinions of the California Performance Review, but it was very revealing what it found. In fact, one of the conclusions it led to is that we were going to have, through attrition, the need for a lot more state employees, which was counterintuitive to the slogan. But it was more than just advertising. There was a very substantive reorganization study, an effort that was brought forward by the Schwarzenegger administration. I do think we're blowing up some boxes, though, with political reform, Pat. I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't know what all the consequences, maybe this sounds a bit reckless, but I don't know what all the consequences will be, say, of open primary and top two. But we're in such desperate need of some political shakeup to just break away the old paradigms of how we've been sending legislators to Sacramento, at least for the last decade, if not the last two, that it's something that I think we should embrace with interest and vigor. And if we had come to conclusions about it needing to be changed, then we should do so in the future. But it certainly blows up a box. When you have these 28, I don't say it's 29, intra-party runoffs, I mean, that is a conventional box that has been exploded in the way campaigns are proceeding.
I'm thinking of the biggest box of all, which is Prop 13. And we have a new generation that is not, at least in the homeowner sense, the beneficiary. And the question of split roll, which people like Mayor Villaraigosa have begun to undertake, a question of whether that can be brought to voters or if that's too nuanced, again, to get to Mac's point about how difficult the Prop 98 funding language was. Can you say something like, we're going to change Prop 13 and this is how it's going to work, with a mind to all those other things that would change along with it? You could change the tax structure so you're not so income tax dependent. Now, I think it was like the 20th anniversary of Prop 13, I went up to where Howard Jarvis is buried in Forest Lawn, and I sat there and I said, okay, if you don't want to change split roll, speak up. And he didn't say anything, so I'm going on the strength. I've got Howard behind me here on this. So I don't know if who of you would want to take on the question of addressing Prop 13, which paradoxically, as an effort to make government locally accountable, ended up putting much more power in the hands of Sacramento, if not much more money.
Well, I'll jump in. I think it's been a third of a century since it passed, and I'm not sure the discussion about Prop 13 has changed at all in that time. And I think it's because you're either an ardent supporter of it or an ardent opponent of it. And I think if we kind of started with Peter's question about, well, what did we like about it? And there's a lot to like about it for homeowners, but what was the most troubling aspect of it? And I think he nailed it. And that is, we had this great local tax, property tax, and we put it under the control of the state. And so are there ways that we can kind of enjoy the benefits of it while hopefully returning some authority to locals? And I'd like to think we could approach that in more moderate language than we have in the past 33 years. Boy, that's the
campaign flyer right there. I think you just nailed it there. Somebody else?
Well, I would say, I think, just piggybacking on that, there is a governance aspect to Prop 13 that is often not appreciated, which is it does, as one of our later panelists, Joe Matthews, wrote in his book with Mark Paul, that there's this effect of Prop 13 of basically removing authority from local governments to make any decisions about taxation of consequence. So they end up being kind of focused on the spending side of the ledger only, or primarily. And then you combine that with the 2/3 vote for taxes and so forth, and I think it does have an effect of clouding accountability, which is a very important governance issue. You want your system to be as transparent as possible, and for people to be able to make decisions about who's responsible as much as possible, and that's difficult under this system. And I think in that respect, some of the other things that we have done in the last 20 years, some of the reforms are moving things in the right direction in terms of accountability. I think redistricting is especially helpful there because it makes for more competitive districts. I think the term limits reform we just passed is probably helpful in that respect because now people can be longer in the legislature and stand before voters for the decisions that they've made, and those are all very good things. But I think there is that aspect of Prop 13 that people often don't talk about as much.
Steve, we're discussing some of the reforms that have been instituted, like the top two voting and redistricting, but California voters like to upset the apple cart. So what's to say that we even give this enough time to work and somebody comes along, somebody who has enough money to fund a ballot initiative and says, hey, let's try this. We seem to be in a constant state of flux about just the way we approach our institutions.
Well, yes.
I'm waiting for the dissertation.
All that can happen, but I think why we're all here is that we want to keep making progress, and it's not necessarily going to be sweeping. It may be incremental, and I think that's what we're going to make incremental progress and see how it is and evaluate it and see how we might adjust it a little bit here or there and keep trying to move it forward to a better, more responsive democracy. And I think that's the path that we're on. You know, speaking of 98 and 13, I think one interesting idea is to require that ballot initiatives have to be renewed after 30 years.
So that they would sunset?
Yeah, I think that a lot of, going right after 13, if that was your intentions, or 98, I think those are difficult. But I think that, you know, even the Prop 30 has a realignment funding element that deals with giving local governments a guaranteed funding source. So that's an incremental change in funding and governance in one aspect of our civic life, mostly criminal justice. So these things all have to be looked at, and you just may not get it all. Something as sweeping as we should put 13 on the ballot again versus let's put all the ballot initiatives on every 30 years might be another way to take a look at it.
So there'd be term limits for legislators. There could be term limits for ballot initiatives.
Certainly there could be. And I think that's the whole idea here is that we want to make progress. We want to make our decision-making better, more responsive, and we're going to keep trying to find the incremental ways to make it that. That's why everybody's here.
Eric, does the PPIC find over and over that so many, that just this sense of, some people love the sense of voting for every single thing before them. Some people feel burdened by the prospect of going to vote. Is that in any way a deterrent to people going to vote, especially in the primaries? Is it a deterrent to getting people to register to vote? This idea that we may have an excess of you know, voter-engineered democracy in California?
Well, I think I'm not sure that if you're talking about sort of major elections, gubernatorial elections, presidential elections in the fall, I'm not sure that it changes that very much because people are paying attention to some of these high-profile races, and that's what gets them to the polls, if anything does. But there's no question that in U.S. democracy in general and in California democracy in particular, we ask our voters to vote on a lot of things, and we ask them, more importantly, to vote often. You know, for local government, for a variety of special elections, and then for the primaries in general. That just no other democracy in the world comes even close to asking its voters to weigh in as often, and that is very taxing. It's why I think part of the reason you see such low turnout on some of these kind of one-off elections, and to the extent that those could be consolidated with higher profile elections, I think that would only be a good thing.
Should there be different thresholds? In some states you have to have some judicial review or legislative review on ballot initiatives before they can even get there. You can't just throw any crazy thing like, you know, the Earth is the center of the solar system on there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there have been proposals to have some intervening evaluation as part of the process, and I think that could be sold to voters as long as it didn't ultimately take any authority away from them to make a decision. Because what voters have shown time and again is that they may feel burdened by the process, they may feel it needs reforms, but they do not trust the idea that the initiative or any authority that they would have to make decisions would be taken from them, because they would say, hey, you know, what are you going to do with that authority? You know, we want to keep it for ourselves, even if we feel kind of beleaguered by all the decisions we have to make.
But Rob, I think that was one of the things that came out of a lot of studies, including Think Long, is that people have to be able to give up a little power to get things in order. You know, like the Aesop thing, when the boy reaches in to grab the nuts, he can't get his hand out because it's so full of nuts. If you let a few nuts go, then you're going to get some nuts in return. I don't know if you want to use that analogy in California politics, but it seems like nobody, voters, legislators, the legislature is finding itself partly in this position because it is not using the power it does have. It's instituted blocks to use that power, and yet the voters are saying, no, 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 don't take any away from us. And the PPIC things that I read had to do with a lot of voters who think they know more than they do. They're sort of gut check voters rather than read the ballot proposal.
Yeah, I mean, Eric's right. I mean, to convince a voter to give away any right that is either perceived or real is extremely difficult. I mean, there's been talk of, why, you know, let's take away the right to elect an insurance commissioner. Big special interest election we have every 4 years. Most states, they appoint that. And you can ask that question, and voters will agree with it on a poll until they really understand that they don't get to vote for something anymore, and then they back away from it. I don't know what the solution to that is, except to wrap it up into some type of grand reform that presents some type of bargain to the voters. And then, of course, the question is, well, who's going to do that? If it comes out of the legislature, it'll fail because of the womb from which it comes.
You mean somebody's got to be the front man to sell this to voters?
Somebody, well, to sell it and to write it and qualify it. Now, we have seen efforts to try to do that type of thing, and we have an orphaned measure on the ballot this year in 31 that came out of that type of grand effort that ultimately has no political patron to help see it through, and of course ended up being divisive. Because here's the other reality we probably need to deal with, is that all the constituencies involved here, let's just, you know, from labor at one end to business on the other for generalization, aren't going to agree on what that should be, on what that grand scheme should be. So you still have a competition that must take place between how power will be diffused, because ultimately all the interests involved are not willing to let their power be diffused unless they're forced to. Politics is still through strength, not through grand ideas, unfortunately. 31's full of grand ideas. It's gonna lose. There might be some bad ideas in there, but there's a lot of great ones. I don't know what the course is for the mechanism to put before that grand reform before voters, and try to get them to adopt it. My guess is you're going to see variations of competing measures. I think it'd be very interesting if Jerry Parsky's tax reform was put forward to voters and there's a healthy, full discussion about that. Maybe those things lie ahead of us in the years to come, but I don't think it's going to be done in a way that is all warm and fuzzy. Well,
what lessons could be taken, for example, from Governor Schwarzenegger spending political capital on initiatives that went nowhere, that were about exactly the sorts of things we're talking about
They
here?
were. One of the lessons we took away is trying to solve a crisis that wasn't evident at that time. It's hard, when things are also fantastic and revenues were up. We'd already cut up a credit card. What crisis was being cured? But on the other hand, you also saw the volume of money that flows from those whose oxes may be gored. There's a ballot measure that may address that before us here in 4 weeks. I guess the lesson is it confirms what I'm saying. This is still going to be a battle of ideas to ultimately get to reforms. I just think it's impossible for there to be the grand bargain that everyone's going to agree with. I think that's still the lesson of the 05 special election.
Mac, what about the financial consequences of, the things that we're talking about here, the top two voting and the redistricting have been structural. Are there reforms that could be put to voters that would have financial consequences in contradiction to what we've seen before, which is yes, you have to vote for 3 strikes and no consequence, no thought about how much it's going to cost? Are there ways to persuade voters to be as responsible with the public purse as they think they are with their own?
Well, people have thrown out lots of ideas that, For example, you should have to say how much, where you're going to get the spending from, so that if a measure is going to cost something, you have to provide an alternative revenue source. I don't think that's a good idea at all. I think that starts pitting programs against each other, and you could find an unpopular program that may have great social returns, and someone could use that to fund their new program. I think that sort of ballot box budgeting is part of our problem that we have. I think one of the biggest fiscal challenges we have is our revenue structure, the volatility of it. And there's a couple of ways that you can deal with that revenue volatility. You can either change your revenue structure, and that was the Parsky Commission that maybe he'll speak to later on, which is very difficult to do because typically you have to lower tax burdens on higher income people. That's not the direction we're headed in this state. The other thing you can do is improve your budgetary either traditions or practices. And you can do that by requiring, as we did in 2004 in Proposition 58, where you have to have a bigger reserve or you have that as your target. And I think that's an important first step, but I think that most people have concluded that that's not enough, that 58 wasn't enough, and we've had subsequent measures, Prop 76, part of what Rob was just talking about, the group of measures that the Schwarzenegger administration proposed. You had Proposition 1A that had rainy day reserve reforms that was turned down because it was linked with tax increases. And you may have a measure on the ballot in 2 years that will also try to take money off the table in good times and save it in reserves. I think those are really important measures. I think they're much more important than other things that people talk about. How do we kind of grab hold of this problem of revenue volatility? Because it doesn't matter how good your institutions are, representative bodies are not really good at dealing with huge swings in revenues, either up and down.
So how do you set, then, Mac, those priorities? Because if we have a to-do list of 6 absolutely vital, critical things, what comes first? Is it changing the revenue structure and everything else can follow?
I think it should be at the top of our list of what we're dealing with. Again, either changing the revenue structure or much stronger rainy day reserve requirements. It's the only way that to take money off the table during good times that you avoid building your base up to where it's very difficult when revenues turn down. You have all of this commotion and difficulty in arriving at, well, what do we cut? And it's been something we've basically been dealing with for 12 years now. And it really, I think it emanated from the whole boom-bust period, the late 90s, and our highly volatile revenue structure. It's only getting worse.
It's only getting worse?
It's only getting worse. The personal income tax is our most volatile revenue source. It now comprises over 60% of our general fund revenues. We did this realignment that Steve referred to, which I think was a very positive development. However, it made us more dependent on the personal income tax. Voters in a few weeks will be voting on 2 measures that would somewhat increase the volatility of our structure. So ironically, it's potentially getting worse. And I think it's one of our most important fiscal problems, in my view.
I found myself, as I was watching the Facebook IPO, thinking, how does this affect the California budget? And I shouldn't have to be thinking that, right?
Well, yeah, when you have one or a handful of taxpayers that are providing 1 or 2% of your total general fund revenues, that's not a great situation to have.
Eric, a point that Kim Alexander had raised, and I can't remember where I read it, Kim, and I'm sure you know, was that saying that, look, that she votes for 22 different representatives of herself, from local to state to her federal district, and even she doesn't know who everybody is. I find, too, I often get emails and calls from people who say, why isn't this pothole being filled, or why isn't X problem being addressed? And I say, have you spoken with your councilman? Have you spoken with your assembly member? Well, no, who is that? What can be done for voters to understand, besides the ballot box, the mechanisms that they have at their disposal every single day to solve some of these problems that irritate them so much about government when they're the ones who have the power, if they choose to exercise it, to do it?
Well, so your basic question is, how do you get people more involved in local government? I'm not sure people, the broader public has ever been that involved in local government. There's always sort of a more interested and more involved group of people who tend to show up for city council meetings and be interested in this kind of thing. I think there is a case to be made that over time, as again more more of the revenue side of the ledger has been moved to the state. That decision making has been moved to the state. Local businesses have been less interested in getting involved in local government because they perceive those decisions as being made at the state level. And so to the extent that you can devolve more authority to the local governments, which has been floated here as an idea, again, it's going to be very hard to do. You're going to have to figure out a way to devolve more authority without fundamentally altering, well, not altering, but fundamentally revising the bargain of Prop 13. But to the extent that you can get more of those decisions made at the local level, I think it raises the stakes for what's happening at the local level and brings more people into decision making at the local level. It just seems, my guess is that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of polarization at the state level, and no question about it, California state legislature is the most polarized legislature in the country. And part of what's going on there is that so much of what happens in this state, in this huge, huge state, is going on in Sacramento. It just raises the stakes, makes everybody sort of armor up on each side, and to the extent that you can get that decision-making down to the local level again, I think it's probably a healthy thing.
So you don't think that some of the changes, like in term limits that Rob alluded to, or the new voting or the redistricting, is going to really solve that viciousness?
The research that I've done on this question, it says probably not very much. And that doesn't mean that it couldn't have some effect, but you don't necessarily see, for instance, if you look at these open primary systems around the country, they don't tend to produce very many more moderate legislators. About the only state that has had success producing more moderate legislators with an open primary system is California under the blanket primary, and that was a modest increase in moderation, which is sort of how I see things moving forward as the most likely outcome. And redistricting is kind of the same thing. That redistricting is sort of a crude mechanism for electing more moderate people. I think what redistricting does do, and which I think is a positive, is makes the legislature, the people you do elect, potentially more accountable as parties, because you can turn a person as a representative of a party out of office and elect the other party instead, which really over the last 10 years, it's been hard to do that because the districts have been so uncompetitive.
And Rob, your sense of you talked about term limits and the whether or not that's really working. Is that changing the legislature? Do you really think it's changing the legislature? Because Eric was just saying, I don't think it's going to do the trick.
Has it changed the legislature since we've instituted?
Well, we only instituted it recently, but the sense that people maybe can unbuckle their belts a little bit and say, okay, I can relax and spend a few years in this body.
Okay, you mean the reform that we passed
right.
in June. What I am hopeful will be the most positive aspect of that reform will be longer-serving leaders of the House. I mean, appreciate the irony. I'm basically saying we need to reach back to Willie Brown.
I didn't say that.
There is a... You'd love that right now. We will benefit. My observation from being in the governor's office and watching this now up close for more years than I want to admit is that there is a benefit to governance if you have a longer-serving leader of a house, and this most specifically the assembly. That'll be a positive thing. That the short-term speakers that we've had a series of are politically weak. And that's not good for the institution and for governance. And this current speaker, his two signature issues the last 2 years have died on the floor of the Senate. Okay, that didn't happen to Willie. It didn't happen to David Roberti in the Assembly. It didn't happen to John Burton. So I think there's going to be virtue from someone that doesn't have to get up, and I saw this happen, get up from the table in the governor's office when they're a speaker and go outside and call a special interest to see if the deal could be done. We need to be back to the days when a Willie and a Pete could go in the back office, close the door, finish the budget on a handshake, and it was done. The state was governed better under those circumstances. That's what I would hope that the reform we passed in June would lead to.
Well, Steve, how much does it matter? Obviously, it matters if the legislature can get things done, but how much does it matter whether people perceive it as being able to be effective or not? Because this whole idea of the fourth branch of government that voters and the initiatives constitute, in a sense, just brushes off the legislature and say, we don't need you.
It's all perception. So it doesn't matter what's real. Voter thinks that's going well, it's going well, and if they think it's going badly, it's going badly no matter the circumstance. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. But look, we're always looking for solutions to problems, and sometimes they're right in front of us. I mean, the question of, I don't know who my representative is in local government. Well, they obviously weren't paying attention in their high school, government class, right? I mean, government class in high school, they talk about all that, read about all that.
If they still have those.
Yeah, I mean, in our city council, twice a year, at least more predominantly, usually at the end of the semester, we have all these kids come into our city council meeting to get their civic credit for observing a local city council meeting, and they obviously are doing their job. And I think most high school government classes do a good job. So it's not to speak of the teaching that goes on, but it's like, come on, it's our responsibility to pay attention here. So we want to craft a solution because people don't know how local government works vis-a-vis state government versus federal government. Okay, sure, let's work better at educating, but come on, there is a responsibility to citizenship, and people need to own up to that. And that's why for a lot of these complaints and concerns, it's like, well, hello, pay attention. You think things aren't going right, well, pay a little bit more attention. And I think that would help out a lot. And I think that's the ebb and flow of our world, our world in America. And I think that we can't go too far here. Not to say that there's not ways we can improve, and there are things that are happening that I think will improve our situation.
Australia fines people for not voting.
That's a mandatory voting, and that's a suggestion that something that should be considered here. I mean,
actually, there's probably a lot of money in that.
Campaigns would have to talk to more people. That'd be okay with me.
that's the commission
It's
side.
just working in all kinds of ways. We're going to be able to take some questions too, and I know you have had some as you've been listening to us talk up here. So we have people coming around with microphones as well. So raise your hand, and they will come to you. And we're going to hold on to the mic so we can make sure that the audio quality is consistent. So. Come on. These aren't the smartest people in the room. Okay, there we go. Over here, please.
Steve, to what extent does California government correspond to the civics textbook?
Well, we have representative government, Peter, and I think that's a pretty good connection to what they learn, and the executive branch and the judicial branch, and there's some very common cores that I think remain here in our state. So
He's very diplomatic, isn't he? So what's the difference between looking at it from the mayor's position and looking at it from the governor's position?
well, when you look at it from the mayor's position, you want all government to be local government, and you want it to be nonpartisan, and you want the citizens to recognize who you are, so when they hear some crazy thing out there, they're just going to grab you at the grocery store and check in with you about it. So there's a lot from the mayor's side that says it's working. I mean, I think I'm pleased with the PPIC findings, because I think it's what we feel in local government, is that we are connected to our community, and big, powerful special interests with big money. When I first ran for office in my town, they said I was going to bring in an Indian casino and big box stores. Okay, that was the charge against me. And of course, it wasn't successful, and I won overwhelmingly. But the point is that people knew me. They saw me, and they knew me in various civic activities. And they say, Steve, are you trying to bring an Indian casino to Orinda? And it's like, come on. So when you're connected with your community, as many of us are in local government, you can overcome a lot of the nastiness and negative stuff that gets thrown at elected officials, and people feel connected to the decisions that you make and have more confidence. And I think that's what we'd like to strive for at the higher levels.
Well, that could mean a bigger legislature, and people will not vote for more politicians, even though Californians are so underrepresented in terms of the size of their legislature.
You're exactly right, that's a solution that says, hey, it's crazy that one representative has to represent 500,000 people, so let's increase the size, and let's and it's easy to you get Rob Stutzman on the other side of that, and he'd have a field day in defeating that. And that's just the challenge of it, right? So then we have what we have. But I agree. I mean, look at the Board of Supervisors in LA. Pat, you know this very well. I mean, talk about crazy. 5 people representing, 7 million residents?
More like 10 or 11 now, I think.
Okay, well.
But I haven't checked in an hour.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So.
But Rob, what's against, about what we're hearing him talk about is the idea of being closer to your representatives, being closer to democracy. Why not make that happen? Why leave California like 43rd in terms of, it's like classroom size. You want a smaller classroom so the teacher can talk to more kids for a longer time and make it better. Isn't that the same?
Well, look, I think it'd be there's two reforms I think would be interested in making the legislature closer, if that's the question. We have outgrown the size of our senators represent more people than any other legislative district in the country. It's almost 1 million people. It's ridiculous. I think a phenomenal reform would be to multiply the number of legislators. Now, Steve's right. You go to the ballot and say, vote no more politicians in Sacramento. This would be difficult to reform, probably to impose, but if it could be understood that you have finally greater access. And there's a lot of, there's legislatures around the country where, I believe it's Rhode Island, River Maviglio served, where essentially you send a block captain, to the Capitol. So I think that'd be a valuable reform. The other thing that I would be fascinated with, and I know my friend Joe Matthews doesn't like this because he sees the value in political parties, which I do as well, but what if we did strip ballot labels off of the ballot and made these candidates stand before voters without that piece of information, but more voters would then have to look at them through a different lens. Parties would still endorse and obviously would be entitled to do that. But what if we did do something that stepped back towards what we know works better on a local level? And I like this going with our open primary because we still have this small ideological turnout right now, it appears we're going to have for a while. So the partisan voters are still largely choosing who goes into the runoff. So what if we took those labels away, made it more inviting to voters that aren't so partisan, and actually then forced the discussion to be more about the individuals and their points of view than just blanket party labels?
Why not? We try everything in this state, right?
We do, sooner or later.
Effectively, we did try that in California. We had the cross-filing in the first part of the 20th century, which was, in some respects, just exactly that. You didn't know, you saw the incumbent on the ballot, you didn't know necessarily whether they were Democrat or Republican. It was where you could run in more than one party primary at the same time.
And there were weird results to this. For example, Earl Warren won re-election in the primary because enough Democrats voted for him.
Yeah, he won the Democratic and the Republican
primary. And supposedly there was, when this was going on and Nixon was running for Congress, there was a flyer that went out from Nixon that said, "Dear fellow Democrats" on it. Now, I can't swear to that, I just heard it. Is there another question? Right here, please. Can you wait a second so we can get you on tape? Thank you.
I embrace the opportunity of having local government have more influence on a lot of decisions, but I'd also like to remind people that there are a lot of problems in planning locally for land use decisions, in particular regarding transportation, sustainability, air quality, housing affordability. So it's not like moving all government local solves all the problems.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And we're under a lot of regional mandates that are bothersome as a local government official, but I think I recognize that the air does cross your city border, and so you might try to do these things together. It's not to say there's not a role for state government or even regional governments, but it is still about trying to have government closest to the people as best you can, and I think that's a worthy goal.
We have another question over there. Here she comes.
Thank you. Mine's kind of a statement as much as a question, I imagine. And listening to Mark earlier talk about government alone not being able to fix our problems, and the survey kind of pointing out that involving the local voters is key to turning things around, to creating confidence at local level decision-making and state decision-making. You had said earlier before about not wanting to be reckless, right, in decisioning, and I would remind you very gently that we never really know what's going to happen. I think of an election a few years ago in the Oakland area where a Green Party member won over a Dem in the Assembly because voters were just fed up. And we're kind of at a point where that seems to be happening again. I'm talking to all these women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that have never been involved in politics before, but they're out there with their Prop 37 flyers because they want their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren to eat healthy food. So where am I going with this? I see something heartening happening, synchronicity, if you will. I work for the California Research Bureau, and we do a lot of work for legislators. Last year, we did process for Senator Liu in Glendale. She was interested in understanding more about what her constituents wanted. So we put 75 people in a room, everyone from the the Secretary of Social Services in California to a homeless youth was in the room. And we asked them what they wanted. And they came up with a lot of the same stuff you found out, Mark. They want block grants, regional funding, conduits for conversation, local access to high-level decision makers, more collaboration. We talk about this depression that society is in, and we need to find a way to lift that cloud. And we've seen this at the individual level. I'm a nurse and a public health nurse. We've seen that engaging people can help to do that, and they're starting to do that. We're starting to do that. Last year, this governor signed an executive order creating the Interagency Council on Veterans. That council was put together using a very similar format as the Pathways World Cafe that we did last October for Senator Liu. We've engaged everyone from secretaries down to individuals, and they want to be engaged, and they want to be empowered, and they want to work with government. To speak to the issue of whether or not people know civics, I just gave a presentation on the legislative process to a group of individuals that were so incredibly engaged, it's not even funny. And they were all adults, and they'd all kind of forgotten what they learned in high school. They want to relearn. Is there a question in there? I don't know. Okay. I'm just telling you, be ready.
Well,
They're coming.
Let's find a question in there.
We're
I
out
think
there.
the question is that if the agencies of government don't do it, people will. They have used the initiative process, not always wisely, not always responsibly, but the kind of organization that we were just hearing about too is very heartening, but it may be frustrating and it can only go so far without engaging in these very institutions that people may have contempt for. Rob, maybe you want to speak to that.
Well, I think when people have most notably risen up and used the available process, it's actually to protect themselves from the agencies of government. I hope that Senator Liu was also looking at small business people, and she may have been, and what do they need from government or not need from government? What's impeding them? Because that's where you're right. The people will find a way, and that is why they hang on to the right to go to the initiative ballot tightly. Prop 13 has consequences. We get that. Prop 98 has consequences. We get that. But they also were expressions of a will of the public that they didn't think was being satisfied here in Sacramento. And whatever reforms are coming, they're going to happen through the ballot box. I just think that is our reality. And what movements lie ahead of us by voters around those issues remains to be seen. It's interesting to see how that's going to take shape. But in California, how does it not but come through the ballot box?
Well, Mac, Rob says that in the same mechanism that we've seen as the source of problems is a kind of solution. Can you see, if you look historically at the moment at which ballot box budgeting and other issues ended up taking over the budgeting process? Is there a line of demarcation that you find?
No, I don't think so. In fact, the legislature still has a lot of control over the budget. I think what's happened, though, is that it's lost some of its taxing ability because voters have had these choices to increase certain taxes, whether it's a sales tax for criminal justice or an income tax for mental health services or a cigarette tax. They've all been designated for specific purposes. But what that means is then they're not available for general purposes. And so the voters have increased taxes for things that either because they weren't bearing the cost of it or they felt that they were appropriate in the choice they were given at that time. Cumulatively, though, what they've done is sort of limited our ability to raise general taxes because we've already done it in other ways. And I think that's limited to the legislature's flexibility at a time like this when we're experiencing budget problems. We can't go in and look at some of those taxes and maybe the money, the way that they're spending the money is not our highest priority.
There was a question here.
Yes, Paula Lee, Californians for Electoral Reform. Just back to the topic of engaging more voters and increasing participation and representation. Rather than increasing the size of the legislature, which I would agree voters would never go for, how about, and I was going to save this for Joe Matthews in the next panel because I was hoping he could sing some praises, but let me ask you, what about proportional voting, proportional representation, where 30% of the vote, you get 30%, if you get 30% of the vote or 40% of the vote, you get 30 or 40% of the seats, rather than 0 more voters would be engaged, more voters would be represented. That's real structural reform. And it seems like we constantly talk around these ideas of improving democracy and improving participation in voter registration and curing apathy. But when a voter can never vote for a winner or someone to represent them, they lose interest. And so I just wondered if some of you could comment on that, because it's worked great in other countries.
Yeah, and it's also been discussed for reforming the or apportioning of electoral votes in the state of California, too. So I'm sure there's some oxen being gored up here.
And one more thing, it'll help elect more women.
Well, I think if you went proportional, it would create a lot more interest. I mean, the place to certainly, I would believe, do it is at the presidential level. Obviously, as a Republican, that sounds rather self-serving. I'm not benign to that. But on the other hand, have you seen Barack Obama out here campaigning, or Mitt Romney? And we're completely disenfranchised. Bill Clinton blew through town yesterday over in Davis, but that's it. We would be paid attention to as much as any swing state right now if we had proportionality on the electoral college vote. Now, and that would increase participation. I mean, the presidential race is going to drive participation more than anything else.
And then would it trickle down to other races?
Well, they're at the ballot, so you're going to have higher participation at some level down the ballot. The idea of setting the legislature through a proportional vote is interesting. I haven't considered it a whole lot, but I think all ideas like that are intriguing. Anything that breaks the paradigms we've been living with up here, I think, are worth looking at.
Steve?
Well, I think it's an interesting thought, and it may be a positive improvement. I don't see it being very realistic in the short term. I think things would have to break down a lot more within our current structure. So I don't see it as a likelihood. There is a popular vote initiative that California did adopt that if enough states adopt, it might be something that gets enacted nationally that would be interesting, and I think probably a positive step forward to making our state more relevant nationally. But I don't see that, even though there's a lot of positive things to say about it, I don't see it as a realistic option in the short term.
Let's get our penultimate question back there. There he is.
Thank you. In 2010, Prop 14 was sold to the California public that it would increase our choices, when in fact in the general election in 2010 we had 6 candidates for the federal Senate. This year we have 2. So we're limiting our choices with Prop 14, and that's disenfranchising a lot of voters, and we need to uplift third parties and help to get them on the ballot instead of disenfranchise them and leave all these voters out in the cold.
Wasn't that the point of this, so third party could have a better shot at things?
Well, I mean, I think people often thought it would bring more independent, no party preference candidates to the fall, and that didn't really happen. I don't think anybody ever expected this reform to be good for third parties, because it really hasn't been. You could have
Orly Tates came in third in the Senate race. I mean, what do you want, right? Sorry, go ahead.
I don't think there's any question that one of the downsides, if you support third parties, the top 2 primaries is not good for them. The only third party candidates who are on the fall ballot there's 4 of them. They are all write-in candidates against otherwise uncontested incumbents. So it's just the third parties have been sort of abolished from the fall ballot, and if you're a supporter of third parties, that's not a good thing. I think when people say that there's more competition, what they mean is, number one, there were more candidates who ran. It's all about the action in these uncompetitive seats, where it didn't seem like a very good bargain to contest, say, an incumbent in one of those seats, because if you couldn't manage to actually beat that incumbent in the first round, you weren't going to go on to another round in the fall. Now you have that sort of second round contest in like a heavily Democratic seat where you can contest an incumbent, and then you just have to come in second, and then you can run against that same person again in the fall. And so that, in that sense, it gives more choice for people in those districts, because there's a more realistic contest between 2 candidates who could conceivably win. I mean, you're seeing that in the Swalwell-Stark race, for instance. I mean, Eric Swalwell this is in the East Bay in like Hayward area. So Swalwell would have been out at this point under the old system, but now he and Stark are really going at it, and it's basically a toss-up.
Well, give us 6 years, we'll change it again. Last question then over there too, right? You had one? No? Going once? Going twice? Okay, oh, right here. Hang on a second, let's get a microphone to you, please.
Now, except the microphone seems to distort things quite a bit.
But we can get it on tape that, we can get it on tape that way, so if we can get the mic to it.
Okay, well, I'll try with the microphone. I'll try not to hold it too close.
We'll keep hold, thanks.
Despite the readily availability of very inexpensive internet information via the World Wide Web and the internet, very expensive advertising seems to have a disproportionate role in affecting outcomes of elections. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Advertising having a disproportionate role.
Well, I mean, that's, with all due respect, it's like saying advertising has a disproportionate role in selling cars or soda. I mean, it is what is available for mass communication, and it's certainly the rules the rules of the road that campaigns live within. Now, to your point, though, sir, we are, those of us that run campaigns are seeing that a lot more information is absolutely gathered in the freedom and accessibility of the web. And that changes, it primarily changes our tactics, and that we now advertise on the web more. So, people are going to seek information where they want to seek it. The problem for us in the campaign business is those that seek information on the web are seeking. We need to shape people's opinions when they're not seeking information. We need to foist it upon them, that's what advertising is.
Well, but this is the point Steve was making about civic engagement. You can put out all the sunshine laws with all the campaign finance reform that it gets reported in real time, even though you may have Supreme Court decisions that allow for dark money, but people will be self-selecting in what they look for. And so if you consume advertising, but you may not say, I'm going to go look at the funding behind every single candidate every day or every week to see where this election is going and who's trying to buy it.
Well, the good news is the voters are more cynical than they've ever been and more suspicious of any advertising. And so it has a lot less effect. I don't disagree with the premise, it does, but it's why you don't see as much volatility in some of these measures as you might have seen in other times, because people aren't just taking things at face value. I think we haven't really talked about this, but I think one of the most worrisome element of how our democracy is changing is what's happened to the newspaper business, and where people can go to get objective information that's not biased.
Reported information.
Correct. And where it's what I think we're going to hopefully see is the evolution of some portals within the World Wide Web that has credibility, so that people can now find that new places to go, since they can't necessarily pick up that paper on their driveway, or they may not be as time rolls on, that we're going to need that. It's going to be very important, and that's a big gap that's widening, and we hope that will shrink as civic-minded groups and foundations realize that it's so important to the underpinnings of our democracy to have those portals of objectivity out there for our voters to access.
www.ppic.org.
Please thank the panel, and we'll be back in 15 minutes with another one.